The city learned to sleep with one eye open the year the graves began answering back. Charleston's air carried salt and rot, a sweetness that clung to the throat, and the earth behind the great houses stayed damp even in summer. Solomon walked those yards barefoot, his steps quiet as a prayer, carrying buckets, carrying secrets, carrying the weight of names that never made it to paper. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak it was in a voice that made men lean closer, as if afraid the ground itself might overhear. They said he had been born near water and learned early that soil remembers hands. They said he could tell how long a body had been beneath the ground by the way the grass bent. They said many things, because Charleston has always preferred stories to truth. What was known was simpler. Masters trusted him. They trusted the way he lowered his eyes, the way he folded himself smaller than a shadow. They trusted him with keys, with night errands, with the dead. Trust is a kind of rope, and Solomon learned how to tie it. After the punishment, after the earth pressed his chest and counted his breaths, he stopped dreaming of escape. He dreamed instead of depth. He learned how rain softens clay, how roots hide seams, how a shovel can sing if struck just right. He learned that a man's last sound is not a scream, but a bargain whispered to dirt. And he learned patience, because the ground does not hurry. Storms came often that year. Doors slammed, windows rattled, and the tide rose like a held breath. When the first master vanished, the city blamed the water. When the second did not return from a walk, they blamed thieves. Solomon carried lanterns through rain, his face lit from below, his smile a calm line. He buried anger with care, each layer tamped smooth, each mark erased. Above him, the houses stood, tall and white, believing in their permanence. By the time the rumors reached the harbor, the fields had learned Solomon's footsteps, the earth had learned his hands. And Charleston, proud and loud by day, lowered its voice at night, because somewhere beneath the grass, something was listening, counting, and waiting for the next name to be spoken. Solomon's arrival at the Charleston plantation was quiet enough that most people only remembered him later, after memory had been sharpened by fear, because at first he seemed like any other man, delivered by wagon and paperwork, another body to be counted and worked until it failed. The overseer noted his height, his age guessed by teeth and eyes, the strength in his shoulders, and then something he could not name, a stillness that did not belong to exhaustion or submission. Solomon stepped down from the wagon and looked at the land, not as a place to be conquered or endured, but as something already familiar, his gaze moving across the soil the way a reader moves across lines of a well-known page. And that look unsettled those who noticed it, because it suggested recognition rather than fear. Charleston plantations were places of noise, of shouted orders, clanging tools, and forced songs meant to keep time with suffering. Yet Solomon carried silence with him, not the silence of ignorance, but the silence of someone who listens for answers beneath the obvious sounds. When he was led past the slave quarters and toward the fields, he paused just long enough to press his bare foot into the ground, feeling the give of the earth after recent rain, noting how quickly it swallowed the imprint of his heel, and then he nodded to himself as if something important had been confirmed. It was a small gesture, easily missed, but later men would swear that was the moment the land accepted him, or perhaps the moment he accepted the land. Rumors attached themselves to Solomon almost immediately, as they often do to people who do not explain themselves. Some said he came from a coastal place, where the dead were buried standing so they could watch the sea. Others claimed his mother had been a woman who spoke to graves and taught her son the language of dirt and bone. and a few whispered that he had been carried through more plantations than most men his age, not because he was troublesome, but because masters felt uneasy after a while, unable to say why. These stories spread not because they were believed, but because they filled the space left by Solomon's refusal to define himself. And in Charleston, mystery was more dangerous than defiance. What unsettled the plantation owners most was not what Solomon said, but what he did not ask. He did not ask about rations, did not ask about rest, did not ask how long he would be there, and this absence of questions disrupted the unspoken rules of power, because it denied masters the pleasure of refusal. When given instructions, Solomon nodded once and carried them out with a precision that felt deliberate rather than obedient, as if he were practicing something rather than serving. He learned paths quickly, memorized the creak of gates, the rhythm of guards' steps at night, and the way sound traveled across open ground. But these were not the skills of an escapee in waiting. They were the habits of a man settling in. The burial rites rumor began after a death in the quarters, a man claimed by fever whose body was meant to be placed in a shallow grave before dawn. Solomon volunteered to help without being asked, and when the others watched him work, they noticed how carefully he measured the depth, how he smoothed the soil afterward, erasing every sign of disturbance, and how he paused at the end with his hand pressed flat against the ground, his eyes closed, his lips moving in words no one could hear. It was not prayer as they understood it, and it was not grief, and that made it frightening. From that night on, some swore the air felt heavier near the burial place, as if the earth itself were holding a breath. Masters dismissed these stories publicly, laughing at the idea of a slave with secret knowledge. Yet privately they paid attention, because plantation life was built on the management of bodies, living and dead, and anyone who seemed too comfortable with that management threatened the fragile sense of control that wealth and violence tried to maintain. Solomon's calm did not flatter their authority. It reflected it back at them, stripped of drama, revealing it as something temporary, something that could end as easily as breath under soil. This unspoken challenge unsettled them more than open resistance ever could. Despite this, Solomon was not punished for his strangeness, and this too was part of the first turning point. Because instead of drawing suspicion, his demeanor inspired a perverse kind of trust. Masters saw in him a man who understood his place, who accepted the inevitability of death and labor without complaint, and they mistook this acceptance for loyalty. They gave him tasks that required discretion, sent him on errands after dark, allowed him near places where others were forbidden, never realizing that each small privilege was another measurement taken, another mental note added to an internal map that extended not just across the land but beneath it. Solomon's arrival mattered because it marked the moment when vengeance stopped being an abstract and became a practical consideration. Whatever had happened to him before Charleston had shaped him into someone who understood that revenge did not begin with violence, but with knowledge, with patience, with the ability to move unseen and be underestimated. The plantation believed it had acquired another pair of hands, but what it had really done was introduce a man who saw the land as an accomplice, who recognized that soil could be both weapon and witness, and who carried within him an unnerving calm born from the certainty that every master, no matter how powerful, would one day meet the ground on equal terms, and that when that moment came, Solomon would know exactly where to stand, exactly how deep to dig, and exactly how long the earth could keep a secret. The punishment came without ceremony, as most cruelties did, announced in a tone so casual, it suggested routine rather than decision, And Solomon understood before he was touched that something irreversible was about to occur. He had been accused of lingering too long near the smokehouse, of standing where he did not belong, of looking at the ground when he should have been looking away. And though none of these were crimes, in any written sense, they were violations of an order built on invisible lines that only masters were allowed to draw. The overseer's face held no anger, only irritation, the kind reserved for tools that did not behave as expected, and that absence of emotion made what followed far worse. They dragged Solomon beyond the fields to a low patch of land, where the soil stayed wet and dark, a place avoided by most because carts bogged down there and insects gathered thick as smoke. He did not struggle, not because he accepted what was happening, but because he was already measuring it, already noting the density of the ground, the way water pooled just beneath the surface, the way sound traveled differently here, swallowed quickly by mud and reeds. When they forced him to his knees and began to dig, the smell of turned earth rose sharp and alive, and Solomon felt a strange calm settle over him, as if some buried instinct had finally been given permission to wake. The hole was not meant to kill him, not officially, because death required paperwork and explanations, and this punishment was designed to terrify rather than end. They forced him down until the soil pressed against his legs, then his waist, packing it tight enough that movement became a negotiation rather than a choice. Hands pushed dirt against his ribs, his chest, leaving his arms pinned and useless, and when the earth reached his neck, the world narrowed to sky and breath. Someone laughed, someone spat, someone said this would teach him to remember where he belonged, and then they left him there, half buried, the ground already reclaiming him. Time lost meaning almost immediately. The sun burned, then faded, then returned in fragments as clouds passed, and Solomon's breathing became the only sound he trusted, each inhale scraping, each exhale counted like a debt. Panic came in waves, crashing hard and then retreating, and with each retreat he learned something new about his body, about how little air it truly needed, about how fear wasted breath faster than exertion ever could. He focused on the pressure of the soil, the way it held him firmly, but not cruelly, and he realized with a clarity that surprised him that the earth was not his enemy in that moment, that it was only doing what it always did. Pressing, containing, waiting. At some point, ants found his face, crawling along his skin, exploring his eyes and lips, and though instinct screamed for him to thrash them away, he remained still, because stillness conserved oxygen and movement invited collapse. He remembered stories from his childhood, half-forgotten lessons about burial and rebirth, about the ground as both womb and grave, and those memories wrapped around his fear like cloth, dulling its edges. He thought of how many bodies the soil had already taken, how many secrets it had swallowed without protest, and instead of feeling dread, he felt a growing sense of alignment, as if he were finally where he had been meant to be all along. When night fell, the cold came with it, seeping into his bones, and Solomon shivered until his teeth ached, but even that discomfort taught him something. Taught him how the body clung to life, even when buried, how stubborn breath could be, when given the slightest permission to continue. He listened to the sounds of the plantation settling for sleep, distant laughter, a dog barking once and then quiet, and he understood in that darkness that no one was coming back for him out of mercy. If he survived, it would not be because they wanted him alive, but because the ground allowed it. Eventually, someone did return, not in a rush, not with concern, but with irritation, as if reminded of a task left unfinished. The soil was pulled away from his chest and shoulders, rough hands dragging him out like a root torn from the earth. And when Solomon collapsed onto the ground, coughing and gasping, the overseer leaned close and told him to remember this feeling, to remember how easily he could be put back where he belonged. Solomon did remember, but not in the way intended, because what stayed with him was not the humiliation or pain, but the revelation that he could endure burial and emerge changed rather than broken. Afterward, as he lay in the quarters, every muscle screaming, something inside him had shifted, settling into a shape that would never again fit the world as it had before. He felt a strange gratitude toward the punishment, not because it was deserved or just, but because it had stripped away illusions, showing him the true boundaries of power and the limits of fear. He had been placed between life and death and discovered that the space between them was wider than masters believed. Wide enough to stand in, wide enough to plan, wide enough to wait. From that night on, Solomon no longer saw the ground as something beneath his feet alone, but as something that could be entered and exited, a realm with its own rules and timing. And he carried that knowledge quietly, letting others mistake his silence for submission. The punishment that was meant to erase him instead carved him deeper into himself, leaving behind a man who understood that terror could be studied, that suffering could be survived, and that the earth, once it had held you and released you, never truly let you go, binding you to it in a pact older than chains, older than names, older than the plantation itself. And from within that pact Solomon began to imagine not escape but return, not rebellion in the open, but reckoning beneath the surface, a revenge that would come not with screams or fire, but with patience, pressure, and the slow, inevitable closing of soil around those who believed it existed only to serve them, believing they understood the ground until the moment it rose to meet them, believing they had buried Solomon until they realized he had learned how to bury back, and that lesson, born in darkness and breath, would shape every step he took from that night forward, guiding his hands, sharpening his calm, and anchoring his purpose deep within the waiting earth. After the punishment, Solomon did not withdraw from the rhythms of plantation life as some expected, nor did he grow reckless or bitter in ways that might draw attention. Instead, he leaned closer to the edges of death, stepping toward it with a calm that unsettled those who noticed. When sickness passed through the quarters and bodies needed to be moved quickly before the heat claimed them, Solomon was the first to step forward, offering his labor without being told, his voice steady, his eyes lowered in a way that suggested duty rather than desire. At first, the overseers welcomed this eagerness, seeing it as proof that the burial had taught him obedience, that fear had settled him into usefulness, and they assigned him again and again to the work others avoided. Grave work was meant to be simple, brutal, and forgettable, but Solomon approached it as a study. He paid attention to the way different soils responded to the blade of a shovel, how sandy ground collapsed inward if cut too steep, how clay resisted at first and then surrendered all at once, how damp earth held the shape of a body longer than dry. He learned that depth was not just a measurement, but a promise, that too shallow invited disturbance, while too deep exhausted the digger and raised questions, and he learned to find the balance where the earth seemed to close naturally, hiding what it took without protest. Silence became his most valuable tool. Solomon learned how to work without rhythm, without the steady scrape that carried across open land, using pauses and uneven motions so that sound dissolved before it traveled. He noticed how night swallowed noise differently than day, how insects and frogs created a living cover that masked human movement, and how even wind could be used, timed with effort, so that the world itself seemed to be doing the work. Other hands hurried through burial, eager to finish and leave, But Solomon lingered, smoothing, tamping, restoring the surface until no eye could tell it had ever been broken. The dead did not frighten him, and this too drew attention. Where others crossed themselves or muttered prayers, Solomon treated bodies with a careful neutrality, lifting them as one might lift something heavy but fragile, something that deserved respect even in abandonment. He noticed the differences between those who died quietly and those who fought, the tension left in limbs, the way mouths set, and he cataloged these details not out of morbid fascination, but because they taught him about endings, about how long a body resisted the earth before surrendering, about how long air lingered in lungs after movement ceased. These lessons were not taught openly, but they were absorbed with every burial. Each one another page added to a growing internal ledger. Volunteering for grave work gave Solomon a freedom that surprised even him. Death ignored property lines, and the need to bury quickly meant he was sent between estates, carrying messages, digging where he was told, moving through spaces that would otherwise have been forbidden. Masters saw him as useful, even indispensable, because he spared them the discomfort of proximity to decay, and in return they stopped watching him as closely. This freedom allowed Solomon to learn the land, not just as fields and paths, but as layers, understanding which areas flooded first, which stayed firm underfoot, which had roots thick enough to catch a blade and slow progress, and which were clear and welcoming to the shovel. He began to understand silence not just as the absence of sound, but as a condition that could be created and controlled. There were silences that invited attention and silences that erased it. And Solomon practiced the latter, making his presence so unremarkable that it slipped from memory even as it passed directly before someone's eyes. Men spoke freely around him, assuming he was focused only on his task, and in doing so they revealed patterns, habits, routes taken at night, fears whispered after dark. Solomon listened and stored these things alongside his knowledge of soil and depth, recognizing that information, like a body, needed the right place and pressure to disappear. As weeks turned into months, burial work ceased to be something assigned and became something expected of him, and expectation bred trust. Overseers left him alone to finish tasks. Guards nodded him through gates without challenge, and the dead accumulated beneath his care in a quiet geography. Only he fully understood. He knew which graves would settle quickly, and which would need revisiting, which mounds would draw attention, and which would melt back into the landscape after the first rain, and he learned to read the surface for signs invisible to the untrained eye, slight depressions, changes in grass color, the subtle language of disturbed ground. Solomon also learned restraint, because the work tempted him with power before its time. Each grave was proof that the earth could be opened and closed at will, that a human being could be erased with enough patience, and the knowledge burned in him like a slow fire. But he did nothing reckless, because grave work taught him that haste left marks, and marks invited questions. He waited, refining his understanding, letting his reputation as a reliable digger grow until it shielded him more effectively than any lie. The others in the quarters noticed the change in him, though few could name it. Solomon spoke even less than before, his movements economical, his gaze often drawn to the ground, as if listening to something beneath it. Some avoided him, uneasy with his closeness to death, while others sought him out quietly, asking him to say words over their loved ones to make sure they rested properly. Solomon did not refuse, and in these moments he practiced another kind of silence, the silence of shared understanding, the unspoken acknowledgement that the ground belonged to everyone in the end, regardless of chains or titles. Through volunteering for grave work, Solomon transformed the punishment, meant to humble him into an education no master could have imagined granting. He learned how earth behaved under pressure, how depth concealed truth, how silence could be shaped and used, and how death moved through the plantation like a shadow that answered to no authority. Each grave strengthened his connection to the land and sharpened his patience, preparing him for acts not yet taken. And as he tamped the soil smooth for the last burial of that season, his hands steady and his breath even, Solomon understood that he was no longer merely surviving beneath the weight of the world, but learning how to use that weight, how to direct it, how to let it settle slowly and completely over those who believed they controlled it, trusting that the ground would remember his touch when the time came. The first master disappeared on a night when the sky seemed determined to erase itself, clouds dragging low and heavy, while wind worried the trees into constant motion, and the storm gave Charleston the kind of darkness that made even familiar paths feel newly dangerous. Rain came down in sheets, blurring lantern light, and turning the ground into a living thing that shifted underfoot, and Solomon watched it all from the edge of the yard with a calm that had been carefully practiced. Storms changed rules, he had learned, washing away tracks, softening earth, swallowing sound, and when thunder cracked close enough to rattle windows, he understood that the land itself was offering cover. The master had been drinking, angry at the weather, and angrier still at the delays it caused, pacing the gallery with a bottle in hand and complaining to anyone who would listen about losses and disobedience. He barely noticed Solomon when he ordered him to fetch something from the smokehouse, trusting the habit of command to carry the man into motion without thought. Solomon obeyed, because obedience was the simplest way to move freely, and as he crossed the yard, rain plastered his shirt to his skin and turned the path into a shallow stream, erasing his footprints almost as soon as they were made. Near the smokehouse, the master followed, still talking, his voice raised to compete with the storm, and when he slipped on the mud and cursed, Solomon reached out instinctively, steadying him, an action that would later be remembered as loyalty rather than opportunity. The wind howled through the trees, bending branches low, and the thunder rolled long enough to mask any sudden sound. It happened quickly, not with drama or rage, but with precision shaped by months of preparation, Solomon guiding the master toward the soft ground behind the outbuilding where rain had already begun to pool, where the soil was loose and eager. The struggle was brief, more confusion than resistance, the master's drunken weight working against him as Solomon used leverage rather than strength, pushing him down, pressing him into the mud while the storm did the rest. Rain filled mouths and ears, thunder swallowed shouts, and the ground accepted the intrusion with a familiarity that surprised even Solomon, as if this place had been waiting. He worked with speed born of practice, hands moving efficiently, using the loosened soil to his advantage, packing it tight, pressing down until movement slowed and then stopped, until the master's struggles became faint vibrations that faded beneath the steady percussion of rain. When it was done, Solomon did not rush away. He smoothed the surface carefully, even in the storm, using his palms to erase signs of disturbance, scattering debris so it looked as though the wind had done the work. Water pooled and then ran off, leaving behind a patch of ground, no different from the rest of the yard, and Solomon stood there for a moment, rain streaming down his face, listening not for sound but for its absence. The storm continued its work, indifferent, and Solomon felt something settle inside him, not triumph but confirmation. By morning, the master's absence was noticed, confusion spreading through the house like a slow stain. Servants were questioned, Dogs were set loose, and riders were sent along the road. But the storm had stripped the night of evidence, washing away any trace that might have led elsewhere. Solomon answered questions calmly, saying only what he had been asked to do, where he had been sent, and because these answers were true, they were accepted without challenge. He even joined the search, moving through the fields and yards with the others, his eyes trained to spot disturbances that he knew would not be there. As hours turned into days, speculation took hold. Some said the master had ridden out into the storm and been thrown, others suggested thieves or rivals, and a few whispered about the river, swollen and dangerous, eager to claim the careless. The idea that the ground behind the smokehouse held anything other than mud never surfaced, because it was too close, too ordinary, too bound up in the daily routines of the plantation to invite suspicion. Solomon moved through this uncertainty like a shadow, present but unnoticed, his reputation for quiet reliability shielding him more effectively than any alubi. The earth began its work almost immediately, settling, compacting, pulling the buried shape into itself so that within days even Solomon would have struggled to mark the exact spot without his careful memory. Grass bent back into place, rain fed and eager, and insects returned to their patterns, erasing the last hints of intrusion. When Solomon passed that patch of ground, carrying tools or messages, he felt a subtle awareness, like a held breath beneath his feet. But to anyone watching, he looked no different than before. What unsettled the plantation most was not the disappearance itself, but the way it refused to resolve. No body surfaced, no clue appeared, and without an ending the story grew unstable, breeding fear rather than closure. Authority depends on visibility, on the public demonstration of power, and the vanishing of a master without explanation disrupted that balance, creating a quiet anxiety that settled into daily life. Orders were given more sharply, punishments more quickly, as if volume and cruelty could compensate for uncertainty. Solomon observed these changes carefully, understanding that the first disappearance was not an ending but an opening. He felt the weight of what he had done, not as guilt, but as responsibility, because the act bound him more tightly to the land and to his own resolve. The storm had been his ally, but allies were unpredictable, and he knew that repetition without care would invite attention. This first act had to remain singular in memory, an anomaly blamed on chance and weather rather than pattern, and so Solomon returned to his routines, volunteering for grave work, moving quietly, letting time do what storms could not. At night, when the wind picked up and rain struck the roofs, some claimed they could hear something beneath the ground, a muffled sound carried by water and roots. And though these stories were dismissed as nerves, they spread anyway, because fear seeks shape. Solomon listened too, but what he heard was different. Not a sound, but a confirmation that the land kept what it was given, that it closed over secrets with patience and strength, and that the first master, so certain of his permanence, had become another lesson buried beneath the surface, teaching Solomon that the earth would not betray him if he treated it with respect, and that this disappearance, born of storm and silence, marked the moment when revenge stepped out of imagination and into the physical world, settling quietly into the soil, where it would wait, unseen but undeniably present, ready to be built upon layer by careful layer. The first master disappeared on a night when the sky seemed determined to erase itself, clouds dragging low and heavy, while wind worried the trees into constant motion, and the storm gave Charleston the kind of darkness that made even familiar paths feel newly dangerous. Rain came down in sheets, blurring lantern light and turning the ground into a living thing that shifted underfoot, And Solomon watched it all from the edge of the yard with a calm that had been carefully practiced. Storms changed rules, he had learned, washing away tracks, softening earth, swallowing sound, and when thunder cracked close enough to rattle windows, he understood that the land itself was offering cover. The master had been drinking, angry at the weather and angrier still at the delays it caused, pacing the gallery with a bottle in hand and complaining to anyone who would listen about losses and disobedience. He barely noticed Solomon when he ordered him to fetch something from the smokehouse, trusting the habit of command to carry the man into motion without thought. Solomon obeyed, because obedience was the simplest way to move freely, and as he crossed the yard, rain plastered his shirt to his skin and turned the path into a shallow stream, erasing his footprints almost as soon as they were made. Near the smokehouse, the master followed, still talking, his voice raised to compete with the storm, and when he slipped on the mud and cursed, Solomon reached out instinctively, steadying him, an action that would later be remembered as loyalty rather than opportunity. The wind howled through the trees, bending branches low, and the thunder rolled long enough to mask any sudden sound. It happened quickly, not with drama or rage, but with precision shaped by months of preparation, Solomon guiding the master toward the soft ground behind the outbuilding where rain had already begun to pool, where the soil was loose and eager. The struggle was brief, more confusion than resistance, the master's drunken weight working against him as Solomon used leverage rather than strength, pushing him down, pressing him into the mud while the storm did the rest. Rain filled mouths and ears, thunder swallowed shouts, and the ground accepted the intrusion with a familiarity that surprised even Solomon, as if this place had been waiting. He worked with speed born of practice, hands moving efficiently, using the loosened soil to his advantage, packing it tight, pressing down until movement slowed, and then stopped, until the master's struggles became faint vibrations that faded beneath the steady percussion of rain. When it was done, Solomon did not rush away. He smoothed the surface carefully, even in the storm, using his palms to erase signs of disturbance, scattering debris so it looked as though the wind had done the work. Water pooled and then ran off, leaving behind a patch of ground no different from the rest of the yard, and Solomon stood there for a moment, rain streaming down his face, listening not for sound but for its absence. The storm continued its work, indifferent, and Solomon felt something settle inside him, not triumph but confirmation. By morning, the master's absence was noticed, confusion spreading through the house like a slow stain. Servants were questioned, dogs were set loose, and riders were sent along the road. But the storm had stripped the night of evidence, washing away any trace that might have led elsewhere. Solomon answered questions calmly, saying only what he had been asked to do, where he had been sent, and because these answers were true, they were accepted without challenge. He even joined the search, moving through the fields and yards with the others, his eyes trained to spot disturbances that he knew would not be there. As hours turned into days, speculation took hold. Some said the master had ridden out into the storm and been thrown. Others suggested thieves or rivals, and a few whispered about the river, swollen and dangerous, eager to claim the careless. The idea that the ground behind the smokehouse held anything other than mud never surfaced, because it was too close, too ordinary, too bound up in the daily routines of the plantation to invite suspicion. Solomon moved through this uncertainty like a shadow, present but unnoticed, his reputation for quiet reliability shielding him more effectively than any alibi. The earth began its work almost immediately, settling, compacting, pulling the buried shape into itself so that, within days, even Solomon would have struggled to mark the exact spot without his careful memory. Grass bent back into place, rain fed and eager, and insects returned to their patterns, erasing the last hints of intrusion. When Solomon passed that patch of ground, carrying tools or messages, he felt a subtle awareness, like a held breath beneath his feet. But to anyone watching, he looked no different than before. What unsettled the plantation most was not the disappearance itself, but the way it refused to resolve. No body surfaced, no clue appeared, and without an ending, the story grew unstable, breeding fear rather than closure. Authority depends on visibility, on the public demonstration of power, and the vanishing of a master, without explanation, disrupted that balance, creating a quiet anxiety that settled into daily life. Orders were given more sharply, punishments more quickly, as if volume and cruelty could compensate for uncertainty. Solomon observed these changes carefully, understanding that the first disappearance was not an ending but an opening. He felt the weight of what he had done, not as guilt but as responsibility, because the act bound him more tightly to the land and to his own resolve. The storm had been his ally, but allies were unpredictable, and he knew that repetition without care would invite attention. This first act had to remain singular in memory, an anomaly blamed on chance and weather rather than pattern, and so Solomon returned to his routines, volunteering for grave work, moving quietly, letting time do what storms could not. At night, when the wind picked up and rain struck the roofs, some claimed they could hear something beneath the ground, a muffled sound carried by water and roots, and though these stories were dismissed as nerves, they spread anyway, because fear seeks shape. Solomon listened too, but what he heard was different. Not a sound, but a confirmation that the land kept what it was given, that it closed over secrets with patience and strength, and that the first master, so certain of his permanence, had become another lesson buried beneath the surface, teaching Solomon that the earth would not betray him if he treated it with respect, and that this disappearance, born of storm and silence, marked the moment when revenge stepped out of imagination and into the physical world, settling quietly into the soil, where it would wait, unseen but undeniably present, ready to be built upon layer by careful layer. The flood came slowly at first, swelling creeks and low places, until the land itself seemed to breathe unevenly, expanding and contracting under the weight of water that refused to stay contained. Heavy rains lingered for days, soaking fields that were already soft and turning paths into channels. And with that saturation came the one thing Solomon had always known would eventually happen, the earth giving back what it had taken. It was not dramatic at first, just a sliver of pale shape, where there should have been only mud, a curve that caught the light wrong after the water receded, and when a laborer noticed it and shouted. The sound carried farther than it should have, cutting through the routine noise of the plantation like a crack in glass. Men gathered cautiously, staring at what the flood had revealed, bones smoothed by water and time, but unmistakable in their form, and fear rose quickly, sharp and directionless. No one wanted to be the first to say what it meant, because naming something gave it weight, and weight demanded answers. Overseers barked orders to cover the spot, to dig around it, to see how much was exposed, and Solomon watched from a careful distance, his face arranged into concern that matched the others, though inside he felt only a measured awareness. He had anticipated this moment, understood that the land never promised permanence, only delay, and he knew the danger lay not in the bones themselves, but in the stories people would tell about them. The explanation arrived almost immediately, not because it was true, but because it was convenient. Someone suggested they belonged to an old burial, poorly marked and forgotten. Another claimed they were from a runaway who had died in the woods years ago, and these ideas spread quickly because they relieved the discomfort of deeper questions. In a system built on control, uncertainty was more frightening than cruelty, and so the narrative shifted toward superstition. Whispers about restless, dead, and cursed ground, ideas that pointed blame away from living hands and toward something vague and uncontrollable. Solomon listened as these explanations hardened into accepted truth, understanding that fear, when left unguided, would choose the path of least resistance. Masters seized on this uncertainty to reinforce order rather than examine it. They warned against wandering alone, blamed the flood for stirring old troubles, and reminded everyone of the dangers lurking beyond fences and patrols. The bones became a lesson rather than an investigation, proof of what happened to those who strayed too far or disobeyed. And in doing so, the masters unknowingly protected Solomon, because their need to maintain authority outweighed their curiosity. To admit that something deliberate had happened under their control would have meant admitting vulnerability, and that was a truth they could not afford. Solomon adjusted his behavior carefully during this time, becoming more visible in harmless ways, volunteering to help rebury what had been uncovered, speaking softly about respect for the dead, and reinforcing the idea that the land itself was unpredictable. His familiarity with burial made him a natural choice to handle the situation, and no one questioned his presence near the exposed remains, because he had long been associated with such work. He took note of who watched closely and who turned away, who whispered and who dismissed it all with forced laughter, cataloging reactions with the same care he once applied to soil and depth. As the floodwaters receded, so did the urgency. But something had shifted beneath the surface of daily life. People walked with more caution, glanced at the ground more often, and spoke in lower voices when night fell, and that collective unease worked in Solomon's favor. Fear blurred details, encouraged assumptions, and made coincidence feel like destiny, and within that atmosphere, rational inquiry struggled to take root. The bones were covered. The ground tamped down again, and the incident was folded into plantation lore as another warning rather than a mystery demanding resolution. What mattered most to Solomon was how quickly suspicion dissolved into superstition. He saw clearly now that the system around him preferred myths to truths, because myths could be controlled and truths could not, by allowing blame to drift toward escaped hands, curses, or the temper of the land itself. The masters preserved their image of order while quietly accepting that some things were beyond their reach. This acceptance was not humility but resignation, and Solomon recognized it as an opening, a sign that the fear he had introduced was diffusing in the way he needed it to, spreading outward rather than focusing inward. The flood also taught him restraint anew. He revisited the places he knew best, observing how water altered the landscape, how certain areas revealed their secrets more easily than others, and he adjusted his understanding accordingly. Depth alone was not enough. Placement mattered, proximity to natural movement mattered, and he refined his internal map with this knowledge. The land had given him a warning without accusation, reminding him that patience was not passive, but adaptive, that revenge required constant recalibration rather than rigid adherence to plan. Among the quarters, the exposed bones became a source of whispered speculation, some fearful, some hopeful, but Solomon did not feed these conversations. He let others speak, offering neither confirmation nor denial, because ambiguity protected him better than silence alone. Those who wanted to believe in curses found enough evidence to satisfy themselves, and those who wanted reassurance found it in the master's dismissals. And in that division Solomon remained untouched, a familiar figure moving through an unsettled landscape. By the time the fields dried and work resumed its usual pace, the incident had already begun to fade into memory, reshaped by repetition and retelling until its sharp edges dulled. The bones were no longer evidence but symbol, no longer question but answer, and Solomon understood that this transformation was more important than concealment. It meant that even when the land spoke, people heard only what they were prepared to hear, and that readiness was shaped by fear, habit, and authority rather than truth. As he passed the site where the flood had revealed its secret, Solomon felt neither alarm nor regret, only a steady resolve strengthened by confirmation. The system that had buried him alive once before was now burying its own doubts, but beneath superstition and denial, and he recognized this as a deeper vulnerability than any single act could expose. The bones had surfaced and been explained away. The earth had breathed and settled again, and within that settling Solomon found reassurance that his path remained intact. That misdirection was as effective as concealment, and that as long as fear scattered blame and authority refused to look too closely, the ground would continue to keep his secrets, waiting patiently beneath the routines of power for the next moment when it would be asked to open and close again. The final master was different from the others in ways that mattered and ways that did not. Sharper in his observations, less inclined to dismiss discomfort as superstition, and yet bound by the same arrogance that had undone those before him. He had watched fear ripple through the plantations after the flood and had not been satisfied with the easy explanations. Sensing that something deliberate moved beneath the surface of events, something patient and intelligent. Where others raised their voices and tightened punishments, he chose vigilance, and that vigilance narrowed, over time, toward Solomon, not as an accusation at first, but as a question he could not quite silence. It began with small things, with moments that did not align neatly. The master noticed how Solomon always seemed to know where to step after rain, how he avoided certain patches of ground without appearing to do so, how his errands never brought him back muddy in ways that suggested carelessness. He noticed the man's calm during disturbances, the absence of curiosity when others whispered, and the way his eyes lingered on the earth, not with fear, but with familiarity. None of this was proof, and that was precisely what troubled him, because proof could be confronted, while intuition only gnawed. The master tested him carefully, assigning tasks meant to disorient, sending him to places at odd hours, watching to see if confusion or fatigue would crack the calm. Solomon met these tests with the same measured competence he always had, returning on time, saying little, leaving no trace of strain. Each successful task reassured the master on the surface, while deepening his unease underneath, because the man's reliability felt too complete, too polished, as if shaped for a purpose beyond service. It was during a private conversation, meant to unsettle rather than accuse, that the truth edged closer to the surface. The master spoke of death casually, of burial plots and old grounds, watching Solomon's face for reaction. And when none came, he pressed further, musing aloud about how long a man might survive underground, how panic wasted air, how stillness could prolong it. Solomon listened respectfully, his expression unchanged. But something in the stillness of his attention shifted the balance of the room, and for the first time the master felt that he was not leading the conversation, but following it. The realization did not arrive as a single thought, but as a convergence, pieces locking together with sickening clarity. The master understood then that Solomon's knowledge was not abstract, not learned from stories or observation alone, but practiced, embodied, tested under pressure. He saw that the man before him did not merely know where bodies lay, but understood the mechanics of burial intimately, the relationship between soil and breath, between fear and time. This understanding was not theoretical. It was precise, measured, and that precision made it lethal. Fear changed shape in the master at that moment, condensing from suspicion into certainty, and certainty demanded action. He attempted to assert authority, his voice hardening, his posture straightening, as if physical height could re-establish distance. But Solomon did not shrink. He did not challenge either. He simply stood, calm as ever, and in that calm the master saw his own vulnerability reflected back at him. Authority depended on the belief that consequences flowed in one direction, and that belief was dissolving rapidly. The master threatened exposure, spoke of guards and chains, of punishment severe enough to erase any quiet schemes. But even as he spoke, he knew these words were too late. Solomon had moved unseen for too long, had embedded himself too deeply into the rhythms of the land and the lives of men who no longer questioned his presence. To act openly now would require admitting failure, explaining disappearances, confronting fears he had allowed to fester, and the master hesitated just long enough for that hesitation to become fatal. What Solomon did next was not rushed. He did not strike or shout or reveal himself in triumph. He spoke softly, choosing words with care, describing the ground in terms that sounded almost tender, explaining how different soils closed differently, how long air lasted when the body remained still, how rain could be both enemy and ally. He spoke as one might instruct, not threaten. And with each sentence the master's understanding deepened into terror, because he realized he was listening to a man who had rehearsed this knowledge in flesh and time. The master tried to move then, tried to reach the door, but the space between them had already changed. Solomon's proximity, his awareness of footing and balance, turned the room into a confined landscape, and the master's own house felt suddenly unfamiliar, hostile, as if it too had aligned itself against him. He stumbled, not yet fallen but already unsteady, and Solomon saw in that moment the same confusion he had seen in others, the disbelief that the ground beneath privilege could give way so completely. Outside, the land waited in its ordinary silence, fields stretching under an indifferent sky, paths worn smooth by routine. Solomon guided the master not with force alone, but with inevitability, each step narrowing options until resistance became futile. The master understood then, fully and too late, that Solomon's true power lay not in violence but in preparation, in the quiet accumulation of knowledge that turned every familiar place into potential burial ground. As they reached the chosen spot, a place selected long before this moment, the master's fear broke into pleading, promises spilling out in desperate disorder. But Solomon had heard such sounds before, had studied how they rose and fell, how they shortened breath and hastened exhaustion. He did not need to hurry. He knew exactly how long panic could be sustained, exactly when stillness would come, exactly how the earth would respond once it was opened. The realization settled into the master as the ground did beneath his weight, heavy and final, that Solomon knew not only where everyone was buried, but how long each had breathed beneath the soil. That this knowledge was carried with him always, measured and ready, and that the system which had trusted him with its dead had unknowingly given him mastery over the living as well, a mastery rooted not in titles or weapons, but in the patient understanding of earth, pressure, and time. And as the soil closed and sound diminished, that understanding asserted itself completely, silently, and without appeal. Charleston woke to a shoreline that looked unchanged at first glance, The harbor breathing in and out with the tide, as it always had, gulls crying, ropes creaking, the city performing its familiar morning rituals with practiced confidence. Yet something subtle had altered, something sensed rather than seen, like a pressure shift before a storm. People moved through the streets with an unease they could not explain. Glancing toward fields and yards they had walked past 1,000 times without thought, because overnight the land itself had acquired a presence that refused to be ignored. It began with a rumor carried on the damp morning air, a story of ground near the water that rose and fell as if alive when the tide turned, a low field where footprints appeared and vanished without rain to erase them. Fishermen spoke of it first, men who trusted what they felt beneath their feet more than what they were told, describing a strange softness where there should have been firmness, a subtle heave beneath packed earth that made them step back instinctively. The story spread quickly, reshaped with each telling, because Charleston had learned to listen to whispers after so many answers had failed to arrive. Authorities tried to dismiss it, calling it imagination, hysteria, the residue of storms and fear, but dismissal rang hollow now. Too much had gone unresolved. Too many disappearances explained away without proof, and the city had absorbed those gaps into its collective consciousness. The idea that the land itself might be holding something unsettled people more than the thought of crime ever could, because land was meant to be passive, owned, shaped, and controlled, not active or responsive. If the ground could breathe, then ownership itself felt suddenly uncertain. Plantation owners rode out to inspect their fields, accompanied by guards and overseers, forcing laughter where none came naturally, but even they felt it, the strange reluctance of certain patches of earth to remain still. Horses balked. Dogs refused to cross invisible boundaries, and men shifted their weight uneasily, unwilling to articulate what their bodies already understood. The ground did not reveal its secrets openly, but it hinted, offering just enough disturbance to confirm fear without clarifying it. In the quarters, the response was different. There, the stories carried a quieter weight, not of panic but of recognition. People spoke in low voices about the earth remembering, about the dead refusing to stay silent, about balance finally tipping. No names were spoken aloud, because naming had never brought protection, but understanding passed between glances and gestures. The breathing field became a symbol, rather than a location, a sign that what had been buried too deeply for justice to reach was beginning to push back in its own slow way. Solomon was already gone by then, his absence noted only faintly, mistaken for reassignment or disappearance into the constant churn of labor and trade. No search was made for him, because no one thought to look, and that oversight was the final proof of how completely he had been underestimated. He had walked away as quietly as he had arrived, leaving behind no trail that could be followed, trusting the land to carry the weight of what he had done without his continued presence. The city attempted to move forward, because cities always do, resuming routines, reopening conversations, redirecting attention toward profit and order. But something resisted closure. The breathing field entered local lore, discussed in taverns and whispered to children, and every retelling reinforced the same unsettling idea, that the ground was no longer neutral. Each tide that came in and pulled back out seemed to animate the story anew, as if the water itself were in conversation with what lay beneath. Some claimed they heard sounds at night, not voices exactly but shifts, movements, the slow settling of something too large to be dismissed as imagination. Others insisted the phenomenon faded over time, that the earth eventually stilled and the stories lost urgency. But even these reassurances carried an undercurrent of doubt. The land had been marked, and marks, once noticed, were difficult to forget. Every soft step, every unexpected depression in the soil, invited memory to resurface. What Charleston could not articulate was that the breathing field represented a reversal, a moment when the structures of power it relied on no longer aligned with the physical world beneath them. The city had been built on the assumption that land and people could be controlled with equal certainty. That force and ownership ensured silence. Now the land itself seemed to challenge that assumption, holding evidence without revealing it, maintaining pressure without release, refusing to offer the comfort of explanation. Years later, long after names had blurred and records had been lost or deliberately altered, the story persisted, stripped of specifics but heavy with meaning. Children dared each other to visit the field at low tide, merchants avoided certain routes without knowing why, and old men spoke of the ground with a respect that bordered on fear. The breathing field became a warning rather than a mystery, a reminder that what was buried unjustly did not vanish, but waited, patient and exacting. The truth of Solomon's revenge did not survive intact, nor did it need to. It lived instead in the changed relationship between people and place. In the way Charleston learned to watch its footing, in the quiet understanding that the earth beneath wealth and walls was not empty, but layered with memory. Solomon's absence ensured that no single man could be blamed or punished, that the reckoning remained diffuse and uncontainable, embedded in the landscape itself. When the tide rolled in and out, reshaping the shoreline grain by grain, it mirrored what Solomon had always known. That pressure applied slowly reshaped everything. That time was the most faithful accomplice, and that silence, when paired with patience, could outlast any authority. The field continued to breathe just enough to be noticed, just enough to resist erasure, carrying forward a truth that could not be documented or disproven, only felt, a truth rooted in soil and water, and the unspoken acknowledgement that the ground remembered who had been forced into it, who had been placed there deliberately, and who had finally learned how to use its weight in return. Leaving Charleston to live atop that memory, step by careful step, never entirely certain whether the earth beneath them was truly at rest. In time, the breathing field stopped drawing crowds, and whispers thinned into habit, because people learned how to live beside things they could not change. Grass grew thicker there than anywhere else, dark and stubborn, fed by soil that had been turned too many times to forget its purpose. New fences were built, then repaired, then abandoned, and the land absorbed each attempt at order with the same patience it always had. Charleston continued to trade, to pray, to punish, and to pretend, but it did so with a new caution, as if the city itself had learned to listen for what lay beneath its feet. No records ever named Solomon, and no account listed the masters as dead in any way that satisfied the law. Their absence became administrative problems, then footnotes, then curiosities mentioned only by those old enough to remember the unease that followed. Yet the land did not forget. When rain came heavy and sudden, water still pooled where it should not, and when the tide pulled back from the shore, the earth sometimes shifted just enough to remind anyone watching that burial was not the same as erasure. Those who worked the fields understood this best. They walked carefully, choosing paths worn smooth by years of footsteps, avoiding places where the ground felt wrong beneath the heel. They did not speak openly of why, because explanation had never been their shield. But knowledge passed quietly, carried in glances and small gestures, and inherited awareness that the earth was not merely dirt but witness. Children were taught where not to play, not with fear but with respect, as if the land itself deserved boundaries. Solomon existed only in fragments then, a name half remembered, a figure blurred by time and retelling, sometimes described as a ghost, sometimes as a warning, sometimes as nothing more than a rumor invented to give shape to guilt. That uncertainty protected what he had done better than truth ever could. Without a face to blame, the reckoning remained everywhere and nowhere, woven into the routines of daily life rather than confined to a single story. Charleston never spoke of revenge, because that word suggested intention, and intention required acknowledgement. Instead, it spoke of strange ground, of unlucky places, of fields best left alone. And in doing so it admitted what it could not confess, that the balance it had assumed eternal had been disturbed. The city learned, slowly and without ceremony, that power did not end at the surface, and that what was forced down would one day push back, not loudly, not all at once, but with the steady insistence of pressure applied over time. And so the land held its silence, complete and unbroken, carrying within it the weight of men who believed themselves permanent, and the memory of one who understood they were not, leaving Charleston to stand above that truth, season after season, feeling it in subtle shifts and unexplained pauses, knowing without ever saying aloud that the ground beneath them was no longer empty, that it remembered, that it waited, and that it would never again be mistaken for something harmless or still,